Every day, all over the world, people pour a glass of the best-selling American whiskey ever made. It is on the shelf of nearly every bar on earth. The square bottle, the black label, the name in white script, Jack Daniel's, is one of the most recognized brands the United States has ever produced. Millions of people know the name Jack Daniel. Almost none of them know the name of the man who taught Jack Daniel how to make the whiskey. He was the one who actually knew how. He was the master of the specific process. The thing that legally separates Tennessee whiskey from ordinary bourbon to this day, and he taught it to a teenage boy who would put his own name on the bottle and become a legend. He became, after emancipation, the distillery's first head distiller, the first known black master distiller in the history of the United States, and for more than 100 years, the official story of the world's most famous American whiskey did not mention him at all, not erased by the young man who learned from him. That part matters, and we'll get to it. Erased later, quietly, by the way a brand tells its own story, until the man at the origin of it had vanished from the account entirely, remembered only in one town, in the memory of one community, passed down by the people who were his descendants. His name was Nathan Green. Everyone who knew him called him Nearest. This is his story. Welcome to Behind the Throne. Start with what he actually knew, because the skill is the whole reason any of this happened. Whiskey, at its simplest, is grain and water and yeast, fermented and distilled down into something strong. But strong is not the same as good. Raw new whiskey off the still is harsh. It bites, it burns, it tastes of the rough alcohol it is. The art, the thing that turns liquor into something people will pay for and remember, is in taming that burn. And there was a particular method for taming it that would come to define an entire category of American whiskey. You take the new spirit, and before you age it, you filter it slowly through several feet of charcoal, specifically charcoal made from sugar maple, burned down to a bed of black. The whiskey drips through it, and the charcoal strips out the harshest compounds, and what comes out the bottom is dramatically smoother than what went in. This is called charcoal mellowing. In Tennessee, it came to be called the Lincoln County process, after the county where it was being done, and it is not an optional flourish. It is the legal definition. To be called Tennessee whiskey today, by law, a whiskey essentially has to go through that charcoal mellowing step. It is the thing that makes Tennessee whiskey its own thing, separate from Kentucky bourbon. Nathan Green was a master of it, and here is the detail that reaches back across an ocean, because the origins of that technique are not what the old story claimed. For a long time, the charcoal filtering method was credited to a white distiller and dated to the 1820s. But whiskey and food historians who have looked closely believe the technique came from somewhere else entirely, that it came from West Africa, carried to America in the minds of enslaved people. Filtering water and food through charcoal to purify them was a known practice in West African communities. Enslaved people brought that knowledge with them, and it appears again and again in the making of illicit alcohol across enslaved communities in the American South. The smoothing of whiskey through charcoal was, in all likelihood, African knowledge, applied by enslaved hands, long before it had a county's name attached to it. So when Nathan Green stood over a vat of charcoal and ran new whiskey through it, he was not performing a trick someone had taught him as a servant. He was practicing something that may well have descended to him through the enslaved community itself, a piece of African technical knowledge that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery and come out the other side. As the defining step in America's most famous whiskey, he was the carrier of it. And he was very, very good. Now the circumstances, because they are essential and they are ugly. Nathan Green was born around 1820. Most likely in Maryland. The record of his early life is thin, the way it always is for an enslaved person. We do not have a clear birth record, and the sources cannot even say with certainty whether he was born enslaved or became enslaved later. What we know is that by the middle of the 1800s, he was held as property by a firm, a business called Landis and Green, and that firm did something that tells you exactly how the world regarded a man like Nathan Green. They leased him out. This was common. An enslaved person with a valuable skill was a piece of income-producing property, and an owner could rent that person to someone else for a fee and pocket the money. Distilling had a particular reputation as dangerous, dirty, difficult work, and enslaved men were routinely put to it. So Nathan Green, a skilled distiller, was leased out, rented, to a local preacher and distiller in Lynchburg, Tennessee, in what was then Lincoln County, a man named Dan Call. Dan Call was a Lutheran preacher who also ran a store and a whiskey distilling operation, which was not the contradiction then that it might sound like now. And on Call's property, Nathan Green ran the still. He was the distiller. He was the one who knew how the whole thing worked, from the mash to the charcoal to the barrel. He was, in practice, the expert on the property, and he was, in law, a rented man. And then a boy showed up. The boy's name was Jasper Newton Daniel. Everyone called him Jack. He was young, a chore boy, an orphan who had come to work on Dan Call's farm, and by the accounts that come down to us, he was somewhere around a decade or more younger than Green, a kid, fascinated by the still and the copper and the science of turning grain into liquor. And Dan Call, the preacher, made an arrangement that is the hinge of this entire story. There is a line passed down that Call is said to have spoken. Some version of it appears across the tellings, and whether the exact words are perfect or polished by memory, the substance is well attested. Call told the boy, in effect, that Uncle Nearest was the best whiskey maker he knew, and that he wanted Nearest to teach him. So the arrangement was set. The enslaved master distiller would teach the white orphan boy the craft. Nearest Green taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey. He taught him the mash and the fermentation and the distillation. And above all, he taught him the charcoal mellowing, the Lincoln County process, the smoothing of the spirit through sugar maple charcoal that would become the legal soul of Tennessee whiskey and the signature of the brand Jack Daniel would build. Sit with the shape of that. The most famous whiskey maker in American history, the man whose name is on the bottle, learned the craft, every part of it, including the part that legally defines the category, from an enslaved black man who had likely inherited the key technique from the African community that carried it across the ocean. Jack Daniel's genius, such as it was real in one respect. He was a brilliant salesman and brand builder, and that matters, and we will come back to it. But the whiskey knowledge, the actual how, came from Nearest Green. As Green's own descendant would put it more than a century later, there would never have been a Jack Daniel's made without a Green on the property. Now here is where the story refuses to be the simple one, and where telling the truth actually makes it stronger. Because the easy version, the version that spread fast on the internet, the version that makes for a clean villain, is that Jack Daniel enslaved Nearest Green and stole his recipe. And that version is false, and it is important to say so clearly because the false version is fragile and the true one is not. Jack Daniel did not enslave Nathan Green. Green was enslaved by the firm Landis, and Green and leased to Dan Call. Jack was a boy on the same property, not Green's owner, and when the Civil War ended and emancipation came, something happened that does not fit the theft story at all. Dan Call eventually sold his distilling operation, and Jack Daniel took over and built his own distillery. And Jack Daniel hired Nathan Green, now a free man, to be his first head distiller. The first master distiller of the Jack Daniel distillery was Nearest Green, a black man, formerly enslaved, running the whiskey operation of a company that would become a global giant, the first known black master distiller in the country's history. And it did not stop with Nathan. His sons went to work for Jack Daniel too, George, Eli, Lewis, his grandsons after them. By the accounts assembled by the researchers who later dug into all of this, something like 7 generations of the Green family have worked for the Jack Daniel distillery, and members of the family work there to this day. The census records suggest that after the war, Nathan Green and his family owned significant land and were, for a time, wealthier than most families in Lynchburg, black or white. There is a photograph that hung for years in Jack Daniel's own office, a picture of the distillery's people, and seated right next to Jack, in a place of prominence rather than pushed to the back, is a black distiller, believed now to be George Green, Nathan's son. So this is not a simple story of a white man robbing a black man. By the standards of its own brutal time and place, Tennessee, slavery, then the violent backlash of Reconstruction, the relationship between the Daniels and the Greens appears to have carried a real thread of respect. Jack Daniel personally seems to have acknowledged where he learned his craft. Which raises the real question, the one that is the actual subject of this story. If Jack Daniel knew, and the town of Lynchburg knew, and the Green family always knew, then how did the world forget? How did Nathan Green vanish so completely from the story of the whiskey he taught the world to make? The answer is not a single villain. The answer is the quiet, grinding machinery of how a brand tells its story over 100 years, and how a country decides whose names it keeps. Think about what a whiskey company sells. It is not only selling a liquid, it is selling a story, a heritage, a founder, a myth in a bottle. And the myth that sells whiskey in America has a very specific shape. It is a lone frontiersman, a rugged individual with a secret recipe, a single white founder, ideally with a good face for a label and a good name for a marquee. Jasper Newton Daniel, Jack Daniel, fit that mold perfectly. He was a real person, a genuine talent at building the business, a showman who understood branding before most people had the word for it. He was exactly the kind of figure the American whiskey myth is built around. Nathan Green did not fit that mold, for one reason, and the reason was his race. A story that centered an enslaved black man as the true source of the knowledge was not a story that a whiskey company in the late 1800s and the whole of the 20th century was going to put on its label, not in the Jim Crow South, not in a country segregating itself by law. The official company line for generation after generation became simple and clean. Jack Daniel learned to make whiskey from Dan Call, the preacher. The enslaved master distiller who had actually taught him was folded out of the sentence. Not denounced, not accused of anything, just left out. Dropped from the telling the way an inconvenient name gets dropped, until the space where he had been closed over and nobody outside Lynchburg knew he had ever been there. That is how the erasure worked. It was not a dramatic theft. There was no moment where someone tore up a document with Nathan Green's name on it. It was marketing. It was a company, over a century, telling the version of its origin that was easiest to sell in a country that did not want its heroes to be black. Each individual retelling could be defended as just simplifying, just streamlining the story. Add them all together across 100 years and they added up to a complete disappearance. And there is a cruel mechanical reason the disappearance held underneath the marketing, and it is the same reason that runs through the story of nearly every erased black innovator in American history. The system of record itself was built to lose him. Nathan Green was enslaved when he did his defining work. An enslaved person could not hold a patent, could not own a business in his own name, could not sign a contract, could not register a claim, could not put his name on the thing he made in any way the law would recognize and preserve. The formal apparatus that America uses to remember who invented what, patents, deeds, incorporation papers, bylines, was legally closed to him at exactly the moment he was doing the work. So when the marketing left him out, there was no counter record to force him back in. The paperwork that would have proved his place had never been allowed to exist. His name survived in the one place that could still hold it, the memory of the black community of Lynchburg, passed down by word of mouth from his descendants for 100 years while the wider world forgot. His name did surface here and there faintly over the decades. In 1967, a book about Jack Daniel's legacy actually named Nathan Green and told part of the story. But it did not break through. It sat there, a paragraph in a book, while the brand kept selling the simple version and the world kept drinking the whiskey without knowing whose knowledge was in the glass. For most of the 20th century, if you had asked even a serious whiskey enthusiast who taught Jack Daniel to distill, you would have gotten the preacher's name, or a shrug. The man at the origin was a local legend in one small town and a ghost everywhere else. Then, in 2016, it finally broke. That year, and the timing is not an accident, it was the 150th anniversary of the company, a moment when the brand was looking hard at its own history. The story reached the New York Times. The headline said it plainly, that Jack Daniel's was embracing a hidden ingredient, help from a slave, and in that article, the company itself, Brown-Forman, the corporation that owns Jack Daniel's, officially acknowledged what the town of Lynchburg and the Green family had known all along, that an enslaved man named Nearest Green had taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey, that he had been the first head distiller, that he had been written out. The article landed like a stone in water. Suddenly, scholars and journalists and researchers were descending on Lynchburg, trying to reconstruct the life of a man who had spent a century as a footnote, and it caught the attention of one person in particular whose reaction would change everything. Her name was Fawn Weaver. She was an author and entrepreneur, and she read that Time story while traveling abroad, and she could not let it go. She came to Lynchburg. She did not do a quick version. She launched a genuine research operation, by the accounts of it, a project running about a year, pulling in more than 20 historians, archivists, archaeologists, genealogists, conservators, digging through census records and land deeds and oral histories, trying to assemble the fullest possible picture of Nathan Greene's actual life. She bought the very farm where Greene had taught Daniel to distill. She found the descendants of both families, the Greenes and the Daniels, and she found, in the records and the memories, not a story of simple theft, but the more complicated true story. Mentorship, skill, a working relationship that carried real respect through an era that offered black men almost none. And then Fawn Weaver did the thing that put Nathan Greene's name where it should have been all along. She built him a bottle. She founded a whiskey company and named it after him, Uncle Nearest. She raised tens of millions of dollars, opened a distillery in Tennessee, and put Nathan Greene's name, the name that had been left off the world's most famous whiskey for a century, onto a bottle of premium whiskey of his own. She created the Nearest Greene Foundation to honor and preserve his story. And in a detail that closes a very long circle, she brought in one of Nathan Greene's own descendants, his great-great-granddaughter, Victoria Edie Butler, to serve as the master blender of the whiskey that bears his name. A Greene, once again, as the master distiller, this time on a bottle that carries the family's name instead of hiding it. Victoria Edie Butler has gone on to become one of the most awarded master blenders in American whiskey. The line that started with an enslaved man running a still for a rented fee now runs a celebrated whiskey company from the top. The brand that erased him has changed its tune too, under the weight of the recovered truth. Jack Daniel's now tells Nathan Greene's story on its distillery tours. It has publicly called him the first master distiller. In 2021, it renamed one of its barrel houses after George Greene, Nathan's son. The company that spent a century leaving him out now names him Out Loud. It would be easy to end there, on the redemption, because the redemption is real. But it is worth being precise about what actually happened here, because the precision is the whole lesson. Nathan Greene was not saved by the institutions that are supposed to preserve history. He was not preserved by the Patent Office because it was closed to him. He was not preserved by the company's official story because that story left him out for 100 years. He was not preserved by the history books, which mostly skipped him, or by the country's general memory, which never knew him. Every formal mechanism America has for deciding who gets remembered either excluded him at the start or edited him out along the way. What saved him was memory. Specifically, the memory of the black community of Lynchburg, Tennessee, his own descendants, the families who had always known, who kept the story alive by telling it to each other decade after decade, with no bottle and no byline and no monument, until finally the wider world was willing to hear it. Nathan Greene survived erasure the way an enormous number of erased black Americans survived it, because the people closest to them refused to forget, and held the truth in trust across generations until the country was ready to catch up. That is the thing to carry out of this. When you hear that a hidden figure was rediscovered, it is worth asking who actually kept them from being lost. It is almost never the official record. The official record is frequently the thing that lost them in the first place. It is almost always a community, a family, a town, a people, doing the unpaid, unrecognized work of remembering, holding a name safe in the dark for 100 years, waiting for a light. So the next time you see that square black labeled bottle, the best-selling American whiskey in the world, on a shelf in a bar on the other side of the planet, you will know something most of the people in that bar do not. You will know that the smoothness in the glass, the charcoal-mellowed character that legally makes it Tennessee whiskey, came from a technique that likely crossed the ocean in the minds of enslaved Africans, that it was perfected and taught by a man named Nathan Greene, that he was the first black master distiller in America, that his name was left off that bottle for 100 years, and that it took a century and a community that would not forget, and one researcher who would not let it go, to finally set a bottle on the shelf with his own name on it, right next to the one that carries the name of the boy he taught. Everyone knew the name Jack Daniel. Now you know the name of the man who taught him, Nathan Greene, Nearest. The master distiller history tried to leave in the dark and could not because the people who loved him would not allow it.